A heavy iron shovel strikes something hard in the damp earth of an Ohio Valley burial mound in the spring of 1883. The farmer wielding the shovel stops, wiping sweat from his brow, and drops to his knees to brush away the dark, alkaline soil. He expects to find a piece of flint, perhaps a fragment of pottery, or the typical remains of an ancient inhabitant of the plains. Instead, as the dirt falls away, the smooth, pale curve of a human skull emerges. But it is not a normal skull. The jawbone alone is so massive that the farmer can easily slip it completely over his own face. As he and his neighbors dig further into the mound, they uncover a skeleton that defies everything they know about human anatomy. The femur is nearly as long as a grown man's leg. The reports that follow, printed in local papers and eventually reaching the desks of the most prestigious institutions in the country, claim the skeleton measures over 7 feet long, with some accounts claiming 8 or even 9 feet. For the settlers of the 19th century, this is a shocking, impossible anomaly. But if you were to take that same newspaper clipping and read it to the elders of the Navajo, the Paiute, or the Choctaw nations, they would not be surprised in the least. To them, this was not a strange anomaly. It was a confirmation of something they had been warning their children about for hundreds of years. History is filled with quiet collisions between the things we write down and the things we remember, and nowhere is that collision louder than in the dirt of the American continent. Today, we are standing at the exact point where a centuries-old oral tradition slammed headfirst into the Victorian-era newspaper industry. Two completely independent sources, separated by time, culture, and language, describing the exact same impossible thing. One of them is the ancient memory of the tribes who say they fought wars against a race of towering, hair-covered giants. The other is a mountain of 19th century archaeological reports claiming to have dug those very giants out of the ground. Was it all a massive coordinated hoax designed to sell newspapers to a gullible public? Or is it possible that a vanished lineage of humanity has been quietly written out of the history books? We are going to look at what the tribal elders actually said long before the settlers arrived, at the specific newspaper reports that drove the country into a frenzy, at the physical evidence pulled from places like Lovelock Cave, and at the strange, highly political reason why the official archives simply went silent. Long before any newspaper editor realized that massive bones could sell subscriptions, and long before any government ethnologist arrived with a tape measure and a notebook, the people who lived upon the plains and deserts of North America already knew the landscape, and they treated certain parts of it with a caution that had absolutely nothing to do with a simple fear of the dark or superstition. To understand what they were describing, you first have to strip away our modern habit of viewing indigenous oral tradition as mere fairy tales. We have been conditioned to hear the word legend and immediately think of fiction. But to the people who survived on this land generation after generation, oral tradition was not entertainment. It was a vital, practical archive of historical memory. It was the way you recorded who lived in the neighboring valley, where the water flowed during a drought, and who you had to fight to survive. When the elders spoke of the past, they were passing down a record, carefully memorized and fiercely protected. And across the continent, from the dense forests of the Northeast to the arid deserts of the Southwest, that record contained a recurring, highly specific chapter. The Navajo spoke of the Starnook family, a towering, hostile race of people who lived in the region long before the current tribes established their dominance. The Choctaw of the Southeast carried memories of a race of giants they called the Nahulo, a term that originally described a white or pale-skinned people of immense stature who were eventual enemies of the Choctaw ancestors. Further west, the Paiute people of Nevada maintained a rich and terrifying history regarding a group they called the Siteka. According to the Paiute, the Siteka were a fierce, warlike tribe of red-haired giants who lived in the marshes and caves of the region. They were not described as ethereal spirits or magical gods. They were flesh and blood rivals. The Paiute legends detailed how these towering individuals would ambush their hunters, steal their resources, and occasionally resort to cannibalism. The physical descriptions were remarkably consistent across tribes that had no contact with one another. They were always exceptionally tall, often possessing a heavy brow, distinct hair coloring, usually red or auburn, and they were frequently described as being covered in thick hair or wearing the heavy, untanned hides of animals that made them appear wild and savage. To us, sitting in the comfort of the modern world, it sounds like classic folklore, the kind of myth a culture invents to explain the dangers of the wilderness. But to the people who lived off that land every single day, it was a practical history. The Paiute memory was so specific that it detailed a final, brutal war of extermination. The elders claimed that the tribes eventually banded together, driving the last of the red-haired giants into a cave. When the giants refused to surrender, the allied tribes piled brush at the mouth of the cave and set it on fire, either suffocating those inside or killing them as they tried to escape the flames. The exact location of this event was handed down through the generations, a dark mark on the map of their ancestral territory. We tend to look at these stories with a deep sense of condescension. We assume that early peoples simply found large dinosaur fossils or mammoth bones and, lacking an understanding of paleontology, invented stories of giant humans to explain them away. But that assumption ignores the highly specific human characteristics embedded in the stories. The legends do not describe enormous four-legged beasts with trunks. They describe tool-wielding, language-speaking, warring tribes of humans who simply possessed an extraordinary and intimidating physical stature. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on them. The question we have to ask ourselves is not whether the Native Americans were making up campfire stories, but whether oral memory could successfully preserve the record of a real, physical encounter with a deeply anomalous group of people. Because hold on to that story of the Paiute and the Navajo. Keep the image of those tall, red-haired rivals in your mind. In a few moments, a completely different group of people, carrying iron shovels and writing in English, are going to arrive on that exact same land. They are going to start digging, and what they record in their journals and local papers should not have matched the ancient legends at all. But it did. We are going to look at what the 19th century excavators actually found in the dirt, at the anatomical details that terrified the early settlers, at why the official version leaves so much unexplained, and at the physical evidence that survived the destruction of the graves. And this is where the story stops being a legend, because someone finally wrote it down as fact. In the early and middle years of the 19th century, the United States was expanding westward at a relentless pace. Settlers, farmers, and prospectors were pushing into the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi Basin, and the deserts of the West. As they cleared forests and plowed fields, they immediately ran into something that completely shattered their understanding of the continent. The landscape was covered in massive, geometrically perfect earthworks. There were conical mounds, massive flat-topped pyramids of soil, and sprawling embankments shaped like great serpents and birds. Some of these structures were so large they rivaled the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The settlers were looking at the remnants of the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippian cultures, civilizations that had engaged in massive agricultural and engineering projects thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. But the settlers of the 1800s had a profound ideological problem. Because of the racial prejudices of the time, they simply could not accept that the Native American tribes they were actively displacing were capable of such monumental engineering. They looked at the sophisticated mounds and decided that a completely different, highly advanced, and likely white race must have built them in the deep past, only to be wiped out by the savage ancestors of the current Native Americans. This was known as the mound builder myth, and it was widely accepted as absolute historical fact by the general public of the 19th century. It was the perfect ideological excuse to take the land. After all, if the Native Americans had stolen the land from the original, civilized mound builders, then the European settlers were entirely justified in taking it back. It was within this highly charged, deeply biased atmosphere that the digging began. Farmers wanted to level the mounds to plant crops. Early antiquarians wanted to dig into them to find treasure and artifacts, and what they found inside triggered a media frenzy that lasted for nearly a century. When they broke into the burial chambers at the heart of the mounds, they did not just find pottery and copper bracelets. They found bones. And according to the newspapers of the era, the bones were impossibly large. In 1879, a newspaper in Indiana reported the discovery of a skeleton unearthed from a mound that measured 9 feet and 8 inches in length. In 1883, the Smithsonian Institution itself dispatched a team to South Charleston, West Virginia, to excavate the Creel Mound. The official dispatch from the dig noted the discovery of a skeleton that was unusually large, measuring over 7 feet in length, surrounded by heavy copper bracelets and pieces of mica. In 1895, a paper in San Diego published a massive spread about the discovery of a giant mummy found in a cave, allegedly measuring 8 feet and 4 inches tall. The reports poured in from Ohio, from Wisconsin, from Nevada, and from New York. And they were not just vague claims of tall people. The anatomical details provided in these articles were disturbingly specific. Over and over again, independent reports from different states mentioned the exact same strange anomalies. The skulls were described as having incredibly thick bone, sometimes an inch thick. The jaws were said to be so disproportionately large that a modern man could fit the ancient jawbone over his own face with room to spare. And most bizarrely, dozens of accounts specifically noted that the giant skulls possessed double rows of teeth, both on the upper and lower jaws. Look at what this means. Notice the pattern here. You have rural farmers in Ohio, wealthy antiquarians in New York, and miners in Nevada, none of whom are communicating with one another, all reporting the exact same specific, bizarre anatomical anomalies in the local press. And even more unsettling, these Victorian-era reports perfectly mirrored the ancient indigenous legends. The settlers were completely unaware of the Paiute or Choctaw oral histories regarding giant, hostile tribes. They did not care about Native American legends, yet, line by line, the physical evidence they claimed to be pulling from the earth was a perfect physical manifestation of the exact monsters the native grandmothers had been warning their children about. The ancient oral tradition said giants lived here. The modern newspaper said, we just dug them up. By the late 1800s, the existence of a vanished race of giants was largely accepted by the reading public as a simple matter of historical record. The New York Times ran multiple articles detailing the discovery of these massive skeletons, treating them not as folklore, but as scientific breakthroughs. Every time investigators tried to close the case on the ancient history of the Americas, one more piece of evidence, one more colossal femur, one more oversized skull, pulled it back open. And no one in the established scientific community could explain how it got there. The tension was building to a breaking point. So, we are left with two completely different accounts, separated by centuries, cultures, and languages, that should have absolutely nothing in common. And yet, they describe the exact same impossible thing. One of them has to be wrong, unless neither of them is. But there was something none of them had checked yet, and when modern historians finally did, the whole case changed shape. To understand what really happened here, we have to pull back the curtain on the 19th century and look at the one piece of evidence everyone had overlooked: the nature of the media itself. The immediate and most rational reaction to these newspaper clippings is deep, unwavering skepticism. And that skepticism is entirely justified. The 19th century was the golden age of yellow journalism and the great American hoax. Newspapers in the 1800s were not the rigorous, fact-checked institutions we imagine today. They were highly competitive, fiercely local businesses that survived on sensationalism. A boring report about finding normal human bones in a mound would sell 0 papers. A breathless dispatch about unearthing an 8-foot giant with a double row of teeth would be syndicated across the country, bringing fame and money to the local editor. We know for a biological fact that hoaxes were common. The most famous example is the Cardiff Giant of 1869. A man named George Hull hired stonecutters to carve a massive 10-foot-tall human figure out of a block of gypsum. He buried it on a farm in New York, waited a year, and then had workmen dig it up. The public flocked to see it, paying 50 cents a head, believing they were looking at a petrified giant from the biblical era. It was a complete fraud, eventually exposed by scientists, but it proved how desperately the public wanted to believe in giants. Furthermore, the early settlers were completely ignorant of paleontology. When a farmer dug up the massive femur of a prehistoric mastodon or a woolly mammoth, he had no concept of an extinct elephant. He saw a massive bone that looked vaguely like a human leg bone and immediately assumed it belonged to a giant man. Add to this the very real ideological motive we discussed earlier. The settlers wanted to justify taking Native American land. By promoting the idea of a lost, giant, civilized race that was supposedly exterminated by the Indians, the settlers could frame their own conquest as an act of historical justice. It was a convenient, racist political narrative dressed up as archaeology. And then there is the physical evidence itself, or rather, the complete lack of it. The modern skeptic points out a glaring problem. If thousands of giant skeletons were dug up in the 19th century, where are they today? Why is there not a single 8-foot human skeleton on display in the Smithsonian or the American Museum of Natural History? The conspiracy theorists claim that the Smithsonian deliberately confiscated all the giant bones and dumped them in the ocean to protect the evolutionary timeline. But the official scientific explanation is much simpler. The giant bones never existed. They were misidentified mammoth bones, outright lies invented by bored newspaper editors, and exaggerated measurements by amateur farmers who did not know how to articulate a skeleton. This is the moment the whole case turns. Because if that skeptical explanation is completely true, then the entire phenomenon is just a massive Victorian delusion. But if that is the case, then the official explanation is not just incomplete, it ignores the hardest, most uncomfortable piece of the puzzle. Because while the newspapers were certainly lying about 10-foot monsters, they were not lying about everything. Let us return to the Paiute legend of the Site-Ka, the red-haired giants chased into a cave and burned alive. For decades, anthropologists dismissed this as pure myth. But in 1911, two guano miners named David Pugh and James Hart began excavating bat guano from Lovelock Cave in Nevada, the exact cave the Paiute legend identified as the final grave of the giants. As the miners dug deep into the centuries of accumulated guano, they began hitting artifacts, baskets, duck decoys, tools, and human remains. Realizing the historical value, they eventually notified the authorities. In 1912 and later in 1929, professional archaeologists, including L.L. Loud and M.R. Harrington, officially excavated the cave. What they found inside sent a shockwave through the local community. They pulled dozens of human remains from the dust, and among those remains were skulls that were remarkably large, heavy, and robust. And attached to several of those skulls was thick, distinctly red hair. They found massive sandals woven from tule reeds that measured up to 15 inches long, suggesting a foot size that would belong to a remarkably tall individual. The local Paiute people felt utterly vindicated. Their ancestors had told the truth. The red-haired giants were real, and their bodies were exactly where the elders said they would be. The academic community rushed to provide a rational explanation. The official scientific stance on Lovelock Cave is that the individuals buried there were normal-sized Native Americans. The red hair, scientists explain, is the result of the local environment. When dark human hair is buried in highly alkaline soil and exposed to specific temperature shifts and bat guano over thousands of years, the pigment degrades, causing naturally black hair to turn a rust-red color. As for the massive sandals, archaeologists suggest they were not shoes meant to be worn on a bare foot, but rather overshoes, designed to be worn over other moccasins for extra warmth or to navigate the muddy marshes, accounting for their extreme size. Now put it together. The legend warned of it, the report recorded it, and the physical evidence in the cave presented something that looked exactly like it. The skeptic looks at Lovelock Cave and sees normal human remains distorted by earth and time. The local indigenous people look at the exact same cave and see the physical proof of their ancient enemy. Every time an institution declares the mystery solved by explaining away the hair color or the sandal size, another anomaly appears in the historical record, which leaves only two explanations. Either an extraordinary series of coincidences spanning a century caused Victorian farmers and ancient Native Americans to invent the exact same fictional creature, or the story was never a story at all. There was a reality hidden in the dirt, obscured by both the myth-making of the tribes and the sensationalism of the newspapers. And that leaves one final question, the one everyone had been afraid to ask. If they were not mythological monsters, and they were not a newspaper hoax, then what exactly did the farmers of the 19th century dig out of those mounds? So here is what actually happened. Not the legend, not the official institutional denial, but the version every piece of evidence finally points to when you strip away the hysteria and the politics. The giant skeletons reported in the 19th century were not members of a lost, non-human race. They were not aliens, and they were not 10-foot-tall biblical monsters. But they were also not completely fabricated. The truth is grounded in the physical reality of human biology and the ancient history of the American continent. Archaeologists who have dedicated their lives to studying the Adena and Hopewell cultures, the civilizations that actually built the magnificent earthworks of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, have documented a fascinating physical reality. The skeletal remains recovered legitimately from these mounds reveal that the elite members of the Adena culture were, in fact, incredibly robust and remarkably tall for their era. While the average height of a human being thousands of years ago was considerably shorter than today, often hovering around 5 feet and a few inches, anthropologists have recorded Adena remains of individuals who stood over 6 feet tall, with some males reaching 6.5 or nearly 7 feet. These individuals were not just tall, they exhibited immense physical robusticity. Their bone density was extraordinary, their skulls were unusually thick, and their mandibles were massively developed, likely due to a diet requiring heavy chewing from a young age. Many researchers believe that the Adena may have experienced a genetic bottleneck, where a specific family lineage or caste possessed genes for extreme height and physical mass, and this group became the ruling elite of their society. Because they were the elite, they were the ones granted the honor of being buried in the most prominent central tombs within the massive earthworks. Now, imagine a 19th century settler, a man who perhaps stands 5'6" himself, digging into a mound and unearthing the skeleton of a heavily muscled, 7-foot-tall Adena warrior. To that settler, this is not just a tall man. This is a giant. Add to this the very real phenomenon of anatomical displacement in the grave. When a human body is buried in earth, as the soft tissue decays, the bones settle and drift apart. A skull might roll a few inches away from the top of the spine. The bones of the feet might push outward. When an untrained 19th century farmer uncovers this skeleton in the dirt, he does not measure the individual bones and calculate the living height. He simply drops a measuring tape from the top of the skull in the dirt to the tip of the heel bone in the dirt. A 6.5-foot skeleton, separated by decay and measured poorly in the ground, suddenly becomes an 8-foot giant in the local newspaper. And what about the bones disappearing? The conspiracy theory claims the Smithsonian stole them. The archaeological reality is much more tragic. When human bone is buried in highly acidic or highly alkaline soil for 2,000 years, it reaches a state of delicate equilibrium. The moment an amateur excavator breaks open that tomb, exposing the ancient bone to fresh oxygen and humidity, the skeleton literally begins to disintegrate. Countless 19th century reports contain a heartbreakingly consistent detail. The diggers describe uncovering a massive, perfect skeleton, only to watch it crumble into white powder within hours of being exposed to the air. The evidence wasn't stolen by a shadowy government agency. It was destroyed by the sheer incompetence and haste of the people who dug it up. The legend and the report were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same human event from two opposite ends of history. What connected them was real. The Native American oral traditions of the Navajo, the Paiute, and the Choctaw did not invent a fairy tale about magic monsters. They preserved an accurate, historical memory of encountering the Adena, the Hopewell, or similar distinct towering tribal lineages. When your people stand 5'4" and a rival war party comes over the ridge standing 6.5 feet tall, wielding heavy weapons and wearing thick animal pelts, you do not just forget them. You memorize them. You warn your children about them. You record their existence in the only archive you have, the spoken word. We cannot prove every last detail regarding double rows of teeth, which were likely cases of delayed dental eruption or severe misinterpretation of heavily worn molars, and no one can recover the bones that crumbled to dust at the touch of a Victorian shovel. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. The giants were real. They were just human. They were the brilliant, towering ancestors of the indigenous people themselves. the engineers of the mounds, twisted by Victorian racism into a mythical lost white race and remembered by the tribes as fierce and terrifying rivals. And that means the people who lived along that river were right all along. They were not superstitious, they were remembering. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves and about how we choose to write history is the part that lingers. For over a century, modern society looked at the Native American stories of towering, red-haired rivals and dismissed them as the primitive imagination of a people trying to explain the shadows in the dark. We demanded physical proof, written documents, and institutional validation before we would even consider that a spoken legend might hold a grain of historical truth. And when the 19th century settlers finally dug up the physical proof, we completely botched the translation. Instead of acknowledging the incredible physical diversity and engineering genius of the ancient indigenous people, the society of the time invented a comfortable, fictional myth about a lost race to justify their own political goals. Maybe the real lesson here is not about what happened by that river or inside Lovelock Cave. It is about how much we lose when we call something a legend and immediately stop listening. Those people were trying to tell us something real for hundreds of years. They were maintaining an archive of human history that predated ink and paper, a record of a time when the continent was wilder, the rivalries were brutal, and the people who built the great mounds walked the earth. Everything we think we know about the deep past is fragile. It is entirely dependent on who holds the shovel, who writes the newspaper article, and who decides what is possible. The ancient bones turned to white dust the moment the modern world touched them. And in doing so, they took the absolute certainty of the past with them into the wind. Remember that farmer we started with, standing in the dirt of 1883, looking down at a skull that was simply too large to make sense? Look at that scene again now. It is not a paranormal mystery anymore. It is the exact moment when the modern world accidentally stumbled over the deep, human truth of the ancient world, and then completely failed to understand what it was looking at. Some doors, once someone warns you about them, you never walk past the same way again. I really do want to hear your answer to this. Is there a story like this where you grew up? A place, a local legend, a warning about who lived on the land before? Something everyone knew but no one could officially prove? Tell me in the comments. I read them because the comments under these videos are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped or tried to explain away, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and there are stranger ones coming. If it kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find it. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason channels like this survive. Thank you for staying with me all the way through. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet. I will see you in the next one.